Now, this may come as a surprise to some of you, but please contain your shock. There are in fact other planets in the solar system in Warhammer 40,000. I know, crazy, right?
Nobody must know the mystery of the box. Nobody! Not even Squidward's house.
Hi, I'm Chrono the Harlequin, and welcome back to another episode of Live from the Black Library, where today I want to talk to you about all the other planets in the solar system. However, I do want to quickly address my absence as of late. I have been gone for over a month with no uploads, and oh boy does it show on the analytics. Oof. But you can go ahead and skip that in the chapters and head right to the video. You see, for the past month or so, I've been in an intense internship with a large newspaper in Canada, one of the biggest, and it's been absolutely great, but it left me almost no time to work because I was busy from 9 to 5. And the rest of the time I had, my parents were often nearby, and as such I couldn't record, because again, they don't know I'm doing this, and it could very well cost me the channel. Because I do talk about my personal problems here, and that's something extremely important for me to do as a person. However, if they found out, I would be in the hottest water imaginable. Now, normally I could work on the weekends, but my dad's also just been acting up a lot, so I haven't had much breathing room, unfortunately, and my channel has absolutely suffered, and I'm just sorry I wasn't here to make more content for you guys because this is what I love to do. And as many of you know, I was never able to monetize this channel for that reason, because that would give me away, because YouTube sends a lot of letters to your house regarding monetization, and I was never able to make a Patreon, unfortunately. So all these hundreds of thousands of views and all the hours I put in, basically it was all done for free, but I wouldn't change a single thing. I just love this. However, I do have something in the works. That being a history YouTube channel, which I have not made yet, I'm still working on the name, but I have videos recorded, and I'm hiring some artists who are going to draw some work for it, and I'm cooking up Patreon rewards and all of that, because that will hopefully be my ticket out of this house when it gets up and running, but unfortunately that's also been sucking up a fair amount of my time and focus for the past little while, so I'm back on the horse making videos. I hopefully plan to announce that channel soon, you guys will know it when you see it. But I do have one request. When I announce the channel, please don't comment on any of the videos on that channel. Hey, it's Chrono from Live from the Black Library, because that would basically out me. So, basically the Live from the Black Library channel has Fight Club rules to it. However, that's enough about all that. But before we get into it, I just want to say thank you so much for watching this video. Please subscribe if you have not already done so. And without further ado, let's get into the planets of the Sol system in Warhammer 40,000. However, I would also like to mention, a planet is really only as good as the people who live on it, and moreover how much they actually want to be there. So, I will actually be ranking these planets by order of how good they would be to live on. So, starting from the sun and working our way back, the first planet on the list is Mercury. Now, this might not shock you to realize, but Mercury is not a pleasant place to live. Since it's so close to the sun and therefore so hot, it can't really support mass colonial life, and as such, it's actually used as a mining world. In fact, most of the population in the present setting is in orbital shipyards that are used for processing the materials mined from the planet's surface. And even then, the only thing of real note to happen on any of these mining platforms is when one of them was discovered to have the nascent beginnings of a gene-stealer uprising, and this would be very quickly put down by a detachment of Custodes and Sisters of Silence, who would just wipe it out then and there. But aside from that, there's nothing that really goes on there. It's just a dead resource world, in the modern setting. However, in the Dark Age of technology, we learn that it used to have one large city. This was presumably some kind of city, probably a hive city or something to that effect, called Scytheron. And the reason it was able to persist on the surface of such a hostile planet was because it was protected by massive shield generators called Scytheron Pattern Aegis. And something to note in Warhammer is that whenever you hear the term Aegis, it usually connotates some kind of force field, either a psychic or physical one, like the Emperor's Aegis around the Imperial Palace during the horusheresy and Siege of Terra. However, speaking of the horusheresy, during that war, Alpha Legion infiltrators would work inside the Mercury dockyards. They would be working alongside the various scavenger clans of the Sol system, who were generally speaking allied to the traitors, but more specifically allied to the Alpha Legion. However, as opposed to what would go on around Pluto, we don't really hear much about what happened around Mercury. And before the Siege of Terra, any psychers from the planet Mercury would be purged by the Sisters of Silence, likely because there was a risk of them having been infiltrated or tainted by chaos, because as we know, Alpha Legion presence in the region. Can't be too careful. Next up is Venus, the planet of love. I'm sorry, I'm just kidding. Now, in our own timeline, Venus is very inhospitable, and that's because of its thick, toxic environment, which makes it almost as hot as, if not hotter than Mercury, because of how much it traps heat. However, despite an atmosphere of thick greenhouse gases, it does in fact have an atmosphere. So, many scientists in our own time have suggested that Venus could be pretty easily terraformed, maybe easier than Mars because there's already an environment to work with. And in Warhammer, they did follow through with that, because Venus was terraformed early on before the Imperium of Man. Realistically, it probably would have been one of the first things humanity did during the Dark Age of technology given the proximity. However, as you can imagine, with the fall, there was a great decline in the quality of life on Venus, so much so that it would come to be ruled by a group known as, quote, the War Witches, which is probably hyper-militarized psychers. And to add to this fact, they would field armies of things called lithogolems. Now, litho refers to in Greek as stone-like or made of stone, and a golem is obviously a construct. So, they literally had stone golems, not to be confused with the Men of Stone. Unless, of course, they are supposed to be the Men of Stone, in which case my whole theory has gone to hell and the entire 40k community is about to turn on its ass. Furthermore, these litho golems would be put to the test when the Iron Warriors, before they were the Iron Warriors, would engage in the pacification of Venus. That would be their big thing, in the same way the Luna Wolves would earn their stripes in the pacification of Luna from the Selenar gene cults. And interestingly, this would happen during something called the, quote, Mer-Yashet campaigns, which you really can't find any more information about aside from the fact that the Iron Warriors conquered Venus. However, Mer-Yashet is an alternate spelling of something called the Mir-Yaset, and I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, which is an ancient hymn from Zoroastrian Persia, and it was dedicated to the goddess Mithra, or Mithras. Now that should stick out to some of you because during the book Saturnine, we meet a soldier named Olanius Piers, aka Ollie Piers, no relation, who worships Mithras. He leaves offerings to her, he prays to her in his final moments, albeit in his own special way, which I find really interesting because it suggests the folks at GW find Zoroastrianism to be pretty interesting, especially when you consider the fact that Azek Ahriman is named after Ahriman, which is the semi-sentient force of evil that serves almost like a Satan figure in Zoroastrianism. Now, as some of you will know, I'm actually going to be starting a history YouTube channel soon, one that I can actually monetize, wherein I would love to discuss the intricacies and deities of the Zoroastrian religion, but that's an announcement for another day. Also, in the modern setting of 40k, while we don't get much lore for Venus, it is stated in places that the orbital platforms and stations around Venus are incredibly luxurious, with fine avenues of gold and lots of decorations, and are literally the best in the solar system. So hey, maybe Planet of Love wasn't too far off the mark. Now, logically, the next ones are Earth, Luna, Mars, and Phobos, Phobos being the last surviving moon of Mars. However, I feel like you guys know enough about those planets as is, and I don't want to drag out this video too much. As you know, Terra is the cradle of humanity, and Mars is the first ever Forge World and cradle of the Mechanicus. Then you would reasonably think, oh, next is Jupiter, right? Well, wrong again, because the next on the list is actually a planet called Ceres, or Ceres, C-E-R-E-S. I'm not sure how that's pronounced. But Ceres is actually a dwarf planet that exists in the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter. You know, I'm actually pretty surprised I only learned about this thing while doing research for this video, because it was discovered in 1801. That's nuts to me. But as previously stated, it is not considered a full planet. It only exists in the asteroid belt. Now, being something that, again, exists in an asteroid field, it's not surprising that not much is done with this planet aside from mining stations, because while there's definitely a lot of raw resources to be obtained in the asteroid belt, there's not a heck of a lot else. However, this planet is most known for being used as a giant Vox station. Yeah, this entire dwarf planet is basically one giant cell phone tower. Now, once you get past the asteroid belt, that's when things start to get particularly interesting, and our first stop is the planet Jupiter. Now, this should not shock you, but there's nothing on the surface of Jupiter because it is a gas giant along with Saturn and Neptune. However, the space around the planet is absolutely fascinating. You see, Jupiter would be inhabited throughout the Age of Terra and Dark Age of Technology by humans known as the Jovian Void clans. These were people with a strong naval tradition who would eventually come under the subjugation of cruel Xenos overlords during the end of the Dark Age of Technology, but would be liberated by the Emperor's forces, and as such they would be incredibly loyal to the Imperium, supplying a lot of high-skilled officers and producing incredibly good ships, to the point where their ships were actually envied by the Mechanicus, and they would have to guard their secrets against Mars very carefully. They were literally Mars's rival in the solar system. These Jovian Void clans inhabit the moons and orbital stations around the planet, and due to their sustained loyalty to the Emperor and the Imperium, they were allowed to keep a lot of their culture intact instead of just being folded in. And as such, they have a very well-developed, almost quasi-independent culture to them, with people working in the manufactura, and in the shipyards, and in the navy, while the higher classes of Jovian society can actually relax on luxurious orbital platforms not too dissimilar from the ones on Venus, as previously mentioned. And part of the reason for this was because Jupiter was almost entirely self-sufficient. A lot of their industry used resources mined from the asteroids nearby in the belt, and a lot of their power came from the radiation produced by the planet Jupiter itself. And honestly, I would say that outside of Terra and Mars, Jupiter is the most important planet in the entire solar system by far. And of course, there are also Jupiter's many, many moons. Too many to really name. However, some notable ones are Ananke, Iocast, and Callisto, which are all used for habitation, Europa, which is actually a geo-engineered ocean moon, and Ganymede, which is by far the most interesting. You see, back during the days of the Jovian Void clans, Ganymede was sort of the hub of their operations, and it played host to a large Mechanicus presence. However, the planet would be transformed into a warp-tainted wasteland because those Mechanicus would sort of mess up some experiments, trying to experiment with squat warp coil technology, whatever that is, and it would literally ruin the planet. Whoopsie! However, the planet would get a new lease on life with the return of Rabute Guilliman and the dawn of the era Indomitus, because Guilliman would have the planet transformed into an absolute fortress, and given its own administrative centers, called the Officio Logisticarum. Now this is important because it served as the beating heart for the Indomitus Crusade, because Guilliman didn't want to have to deal with the Administratum. And to cement this, he would rename the moon to Aquila Adamant. And as you can imagine, aside from the surface fortress, it's also decked out with a ton of orbital defense platforms and more shipyards, because this is Jupiter we're talking about here. And during the horusheresy, interestingly, after Perturabo and his Iron Warriors would capture the planet, they wouldn't really try to hold it because that would be too costly and take too long. So instead, they just left scores of pirates, Night Lords, traitor soldiers, and Emperor's children to terrorize the population and keep them occupied so they couldn't help intervene. And of course, like every other planet in the solar system, they would have to deal with an Alpha Legion presence that would inspire anti-imperial uprisings during the Solar War. These Alpha Legion incursions into the solar system would actually be the first battles of the Solar War, long before any traitors would arrive. However, the Phalanx would actually hide around Jupiter in the dark side of the planet during the Siege of Terra, waiting for the Order to come in and whisk away the Emperor and the Imperial Court. And as far as we can tell, things have been pretty good on Jupiter since the end of the heresy. They still seem to have their good position, they're there producing ships, they've got some good leisure places, some nice places to live on their platforms and moons. However, there would be an incident called the Jovian Purge, where heretic elements on the moons and in the Manufactura would be found to be worshipping Vashtor of all people, and they would need to be purged by the Sisters of Silence, Ordo Malleus, and Adeptus Custodes. However, aside from that one minor incident, life is good on Jupiter. Well, not on, but you know what I mean. Next on the list is Saturn. And while Saturn might not be the nicest place to live, it's definitely one of, if not the most interesting planets in the solar system, aside from, again, Terra and Mars. You see, Saturn is owned almost entirely by the Inquisition. You see, before the Imperium of Man came along, the area around Saturn was controlled by two rival human factions. The first being the so-called Ringers, who we don't know much about, aside from the fact that they did control at least one of Saturn's moons, and the Saturnine Ordos, the more important one. What makes them particularly interesting is their military arm, that being the Saturnine fleet. And while yes, it did contain a lot of really good naval officers, a strong naval tradition, good ships, and so forth, what they were really famous for was their void hoplites. These void hoplites would eventually become the first and the basis for the solar auxilia, which would be instrumental in the Great Crusade, because the Saturnine Ordos would view the Imperium as a brother empire and willingly join on with them. However, the Ringers would not, and as such, war between the two would break out, which would see the Ringers conquered, mainly by the Death Guard. Now, it's really hard to puzzle out what life was like for the Saturnine Ordos and the Ringers, but from the Ringers' name you can tell they probably lived more among, well, the rings of Saturn. And while we do know that at least one of the moons was a stronghold for the Ringers, it is stated that the moons of Saturn were actually controlled by cruel Xenos overlords who had to be vanquished by the Imperium. So we don't know how many of them were controlled by the Saturnine Ordos, or if they were centered around orbital platforms, or if they led an entirely fleet-based existence. What we do know is that their legacy would live on through their void hoplites, aka the solar auxilia, in no small part. In fact, one of the most famous regiments of solar auxilia were named the Saturnine Rams. But aside from that, and some of their upper class becoming high-ranking members of the Imperial Navy, they just kind of drop off the face of the galaxy when the Horus Heresy comes to the Sol system. You see, by the time of the Solar War, Saturn is entirely quarantined, and furthermore, its largest moon, Titan, is sucked entirely into the webway by Malkador the Sigillite to prepare for the creation of the Grey Knights. Funny thing, there's a misconception I've seen set around that Malkador sucked the planet into the warp, but no, it was in fact the webway. And yes, I know that's very weird, but trust me on it. Also, you might be hearing a little bit of background noise right now. That's because a massive rain and thunderstorm rolled in, but hey, I'll keep recording nonetheless. It's not gonna hurt us. However, despite Saturn being listed as a quarantine zone, it did seem still to have civilians on it because the Night Lords would sow terror among the populace by sending ships full of dead civilians from Uranus and Pluto toward the moons. So it's honestly really unclear what exactly was going on with Saturn. Was it entirely quarantined to prepare for the creation of the Inquisition, or were there still civilians on it that could be terrorized? Maybe it's, I guess, somewhere in the middle. However, after the Horus Heresy, there seems to be no civilian life anywhere around Saturn whatsoever. All the moons we know of are property of the Inquisition, and any vessels without the very specific identification and clearance to get near the planet thereafter will just be wiped out by the highly sophisticated defense batteries around the planet. The closest major moon to Saturn, Mimas, actually has a lot of scarring and damage from a lot of the fighting that took place way back in the day. However, the most interesting feature is the fact that the whole moon is a giant prison complex containing the worst criminals hunted down by the Inquisition, who are all kept in isolated, psychically warded cells. You could think of it almost like a moon-sized version of Kangbamaru prison under the Imperial Palace. Also, I don't know if you'll be able to hear this when I add background music, but right when I said planet-sized prison complex for the Inquisition, a massive thundercrack hit. That was just impeccable timing. Another moon called Enceladus is really interesting because it contains the Enceladus Fortress, which is used as a place where the Lords of the Ordo Malleus hold their court, convene, discuss, and keep a lot of their dark forbidden texts in their libraries. This moon is also where a lot of Lords of the Inquisition hold their estates, which I find is really interesting that they just have their own, personal mansions on this forbidden moon. Furthermore, there is also a citadel for an Ordo of the Sisters of Battle called the Ordo of the Shattered Glass. Now this is interesting because the Sisters of Battle are the Chambers Militant for the Ordo Hereticus, and this makes them the only non-Ordo Malleus thing, or at least explicitly non-Ordo Malleus attachment, to the Saturn system. So either they are a small foothold of the Ordo Hereticus here, maybe to keep an eye on the Ordo Malleus, or they're actually part of the Ordo Malleus in some way. That's something I find really interesting, and I think it might be the latter, especially considering the fact that this is a minor order of the Sisters. Next is the moon of Tethys, which is a death world, and contains the Librarium Demonicum, which is where the Ordo Malleus and the Grey Knights keep all their compiled knowledge of demon kind. You know how the Grey Knights seem to know the name of almost every demon out there and use that knowledge against them? This is where that knowledge is stored. So as you can imagine, this planet is critical for the operations of the Ordo Malleus and Inquisition, and as such, the survival of the Imperium. In that regard, it does make sense why they would set up all of this on Tethys, because it is, as previously stated, a death world. And it doesn't stop there, because there is also a large number of demons trapped on the surface of the planet itself, and one of the trials for all aspiring paladins of the Grey Knights is to survive on the surface of this planet without their armor. Honestly, if Mimas is Kangbamaru prison, this is Saturn's version of the Dark Cells. And I love how the second I said prison, another thunderclap hit. It's like the universe is trying to tell me something. Next is the moon Lepettus, which is actually the furthest moon from the planet itself, and serves, understandably, as the naval fortress and dockyard for the Grey Knights' strike fleets. Also, given its position, it's the only reliable way in and out of the system, so you can imagine it's quite heavily fortified. And this is the place you have to go to if you have clearance to enter the Saturn system. Also, interestingly, when I mentioned the Ringers earlier and stated that they controlled one of the moons as their stronghold, this was that moon. And here's another little hiccup when it comes to Saturn. There's another moon called Hyperion, which is known for having low gravity, and as such, people born on this moon are very tall and have very thin, brittle bones. This is generally what scientists would expect would happen to someone born in a low-gravity environment. However, this implies there is a stable, generational population on the moon of Hyperion. But how could that be if the entire planet is an Inquisition quarantine zone? I just went over all these moons, and all of them have something to do with the Inquisition. Well, here's where things get interesting. The main source for the existence of these Hyperion natives is the book The Buried Dagger, which is actually the last book in the Horus Heresy proper before the Siege of Terra begins. The only singular mention we have of them goes like this. The woman was tall for a human, almost as tall as a space marine, but spindle thin with it. Born of low-gravity Hyperionite stock from the Saturnine satellites, Brel had a bone density so thin that she would collapse under her own weight in a Terran Standard G environment. Age of Strife tech devices that projected a counteracting field around her body allowed her to move normally on other worlds. But to Loken, she seemed like a bird with clipped wings, always on the verge of taking flight but never able. In this instance, she is on Terra, serving in a psychic prison called the White Mountain, where Loken is currently stationed. So this implies these guys either are still active on that moon, under, I guess, Inquisition lock and key, or during the Solar War were either A, removed by order of Malkador, or B, driven to extinction. Which suddenly becomes a really dark proposition when you factor in that the planet was raided by the Night Lords, and these guys, given the description in this book, The Buried Dagger, seem weak to the point that they could not have been able to defend themselves all that much without heavy technology. So, given how difficult it is for them to survive anywhere but the moon of Hyperion, I think these guys might actually be extinct. Now, last on the list is the most important moon, not just of Saturn, but probably of the entire galaxy, even Luna. That being the moon of Titan, the largest moon in the Saturn system, and the home of the Grey Knights' Fortress Monastery. All we really know about the moon of Titan is that before the Imperium came along, it was in fact controlled by the previously mentioned Saturnine fleet. However, during the Horus Heresy, Malkador would begin secretly reallocating resources to the moon of Titan to start building up a quote-unquote secret project. However, some random administratum clerk would find the information indicating this and think it was part of a plot by Horus's agents to divert supplies away from the war effort. So, she and Nathaniel Garrow, who she would get in contact with, would try and get to the bottom of it, and eventually travel to Titan to investigate, where Malkador would confront them and explain that while yes, it was a secret plot, it was for the betterment of the Imperium to combat the threat of chaos, which he knew would be an ever-present problem moving forward. So as the heresy proper came to a close and the Solar War began, Malkador would move the whole moon of Titan into the webway. Now I want to address this. It is stated in some places that the moon was moved into the warp. That comes from the 5th edition Grey Knights Codex from around 2011, while the Buried Dagger says it was moved into the webway from 2019. So we go with the newer source as always. However, it's also a little logical because moving the moon into the warp wouldn't do anything to really hide it from Horus and his forces for obvious reasons. Like, do you really think the demons of the warp or the chaos gods would just allow that thing to be constructed there? I don't think so. Maybe they could get away with it if the gods were distracted with Terra, which they were, but Malkador would never have taken that kind of gamble. So, as we know, the Imperium would win the Horus heresy, and Titan would re-emerge from the webway around Saturn, now as the home of the 666th chapter, that being the Grey Knights, obviously. However, I don't think a lot of people realize just how well defended Titan is because of just how important it is. You see, Titan is literally bristling with every kind of weapon and defense platform you can imagine. It has its own defense fleets, interceptors, ground weapons, orbital batteries, platforms, and of course, it is manned by one of, if not the single, best chapters of Space Marines in the entire galaxy. It is actually said that only Terra, Mars, and Cadia were more heavily defended than the moon of Titan. And, as we know, one of those is no longer an option, so Titan is very likely in the top 3 for the strongest planets in all of the galaxy. Now, you might be reasonably wondering, that's very impressive, but where do the Grey Knights get all these weapons to defend Titan and keep themselves so well armed? Especially given the fact that a lot of the technology they use is entirely unique to them alone. Wouldn't that raise suspicions if people saw these unique, weird weapons and armors being made on their Forge World sheets and then shipped off to a giant black box listed as redacted? Well, as it turns out, the moon of Titan has access to its own Forge World, and that Forge World is another moon that orbits Titan. Yeah, the moon of Titan has its own moon. This moon is known as Deimos, and that should sound odd to some of you who are a little more into astronomy, because Deimos is actually the name of a moon of Mars. And that's not an accident, because during the Horus heresy, Malkador would displace a moon of Mars and move it into orbit around Titan to serve as its own miniature personal Forge World. And the moon of Deimos is also very well defended, as any Forge World is. It has its own Skitarii legions and 3 Night Houses that sometimes march into battle alongside the Grey Knights. Now, you might assume, given how the Mechanicus are in general, that they would not have allowed this to happen. You know, having one of their moons literally just stolen out from under them. But you have to remember, during the Horus heresy, Mars was in full revolt and under the control of traitors, as well as under full quarantine. So, they were not really in a position to argue about one of their moons being stolen. I guess that more or less makes the moon of Deimos the West Virginia of the solar system. Another interesting thing to mention is that given the nature of Saturn, Titan, and Deimos, there is almost no population, as previously mentioned, because it's so strict under lock and key. In fact, most of the living people here are actually going to be servitors used to serve the Grey Knights or the Forges of Deimos. So, as far as we know, there were human populations around Saturn who seem to have suddenly vanished, only to be replaced with institutions staffed with large amounts of servitors. Oh dear. Now, I need to change tack here because I've been going on and on about Saturn and its moons and Titan especially, but there are so many interesting locations on the surface of Titan, and I think it absolutely warrants its own video. So hopefully that will be next after my hiatus is over. Next up is the planet of Uranus, or Uranus, whichever one is funnier. Now, the thing about Uranus is that it is not too dissimilar from Jupiter or Saturn in that it is, again, a gas giant, and as such cannot be habitated on its surface, with all of the population of the world coming from the moons and the orbital platforms around it. But what makes Uranus so interesting is the fact that it is the home of one of 2 Elysian gates in the Sol system. You see, an Elysian gate is a piece of technology from the Dark Age of technology that allows ships to translate near a planet a lot closer and more easily than normal when a ship is using what are called standard Mandeville points. You see, the Mandeville point is the minimum distance at which you can translate near a planet where you won't be affected by its field of gravity. So if you overshoot it, you'll basically just collide with the planet, or could end up stranded in the middle of deep space because you didn't translate out of the warp well enough, and failing to translate out of the warp properly is obviously really bad. So you have to be very careful with Mandeville points. It's why so much goes into warp jumps. However, the Elysian Gate makes that process way easier and way faster, making Uranus, while not that valuable for other things, very important as effectively the gateway into the Sol system proper. For this reason, as you would expect, Uranus is incredibly important to the Imperium with regard to defense of the Sol system, but also for regular commerce, and as such, it is incredibly well defended. Back during the Horus Heresy, Uranus was key to Rogaldorn's second sphere of defense, which were the concentric rings of defense around the solar system, of course. And it would come under very heavy assault by the Iron Warriors as they initially breached the Sol system. Eventually, as you know, they would capture Uranus, and as previously mentioned, the Iron Warriors would occupy much of the planet and send ships full of dead Uranian civilians to the moons of Saturn to terrify the population, so it did not go well for the people here. We don't hear much after that, but what we do know is the function of its moons and some of the stuff going on in the era Indomitus. Its moon Ariel is simply a mining station. Basically, every planet in the solar system has at least one moon used for mining, aside from Terra and Mars. Also, while we don't have any population figures for the area around Uranus in the current setting, back during the Horus Heresy, it is stated that there were, quote, untold billions living on the orbital platforms around the moons of Uranus. This is from the book The Solar War, and while yes, it has been 10,000 years, it's safe to assume there is still probably a significant population around Uranus. And this is compounded by the fact that the moon Cordelia is home to, quote, a large habitat. And honestly, it seems like life on Uranus would be pretty good, because there's not much overwhelming heavy industry from as far as I can tell, and there is a nice solid level of defense that would keep you safe. For example, during the Solar War, it is reported that there is a vast array of orbital defense stations called, quote, the Eyes of the Old God. Now, basically all of this information comes to us courtesy of the book The Solar War. Again, a lot of information in this video is coming from that book. However, we don't have much information to go on regarding what things are like in the current setting, because 10,000 years is a very long time. However, what we do know is that, obviously given the Elysian Gate, one of the Indomitus Crusade fleets mustered at Uranus before heading out. However, one of their battleships, called Embrace of Fire, exploded while cycling up its warp drives, and this caused a large chain reaction which devastated a lot of the fleet and caused debris to rain down around the planet for quite some time. This is important because it does show us that Uranus is still important militarily and that it's still not entirely safe. These things can happen, especially on any planet that's going to be of more military consequence like Uranus, which does kind of lower it down on the livability scale. However, there is one really interesting thing I would like to mention, and that's what Uranus was like before the Imperium came along. You see, the main inhabitants of Uranus before the Imperium was a group known as the Azurites, Azure being a shade of blue, by the way, and they lived in orbital cities over Uranus, much like people do in the current setting and during the Heresy. However, they were almost entirely peaceful and existed as a society of artisans who subsisted almost entirely on scavenging. Now, we don't know what it is they were scavenging, but my assumption is that this was almost a post-apocalyptic people who rose up out of the ashes of whatever horrible things happened around Uranus during Old Night, probably leaving a lot of technological and material debris that they could feed off of and use in their art and just generally to survive. However, they unfortunately wouldn't last long into the Great Crusade, because as soon as they were found and agreed to join the Imperium peacefully, they would be set upon by pirates, resulting in something called the Unheard War. Now, I actually have a full video all about space pirates in Warhammer, and this so-called Unheard War really punctuates just how brutal and terrifying they can be. You see, after they called for aid from the Imperium, the Imperial Fists would answer, sending 50 Space Marines to the primary Azurite station to defend the Emperor's newest subjects, and as you can expect, they made short work of the pirates. However, as an act of spite, the pirates would launch several torpedoes toward the station. Out of the 3 torpedoes fired, 2 would be destroyed, but 1 would get through. But this wasn't just any torpedo, it was a boarding torpedo, and it didn't have reinforcements inside, it had a single psyker. who was infected with a psychic plague called the Screaming, which began to rapidly spread throughout the Azurite militiamen. And what this disease would do would be to cause the infected to ceaselessly scream until they began to mutate and die. And anyone who heard the screams would be infected, so it spread through the station like wildfire. So after nearly the entire station had mutated into demons of the warp, the Imperial Fists would have no choice but to act. And what they would do is fight their way to the main reactor of the station and sacrifice themselves in order to blow it up. This would be the end of the Azurite people, and would see all 50 Imperial Fists die in the effort. However, the Emperor would order that the Bell of Lost Souls toll in their honor. And this was actually the first time it was used, because it had just been newly finished. And furthermore, this might be one of the first times that the Imperium actually squared off against legit demons of the warp. So again, horrifying, but it is all in the past now, so it's not really much of an issue in the current setting. Next up on the list is Neptune, the furthest full planet from the sun. Now, we have basically no knowledge about anything going on with Neptune in the current setting, and I think there's an interesting reason for that. You see, both Uranus and Pluto have those Elysian gates that make warp travel so easy. So if you're gonna go to Pluto, just go to Pluto. If you're gonna go to Uranus, just go to Uranus. And if you need to get from Pluto to Uranus, just use again the Elysian gates, which leaves Neptune in the position of effectively being a flyover state, having only a small population and being used to extract resources, but not much else. In fact, the only singular thing we know about Neptune from the current setting is, while yes, it is a gas giant and has no one on the surface, the moon of Triton is being used to mine something called Corvinium for the Imperium. That's all we know. And we only know this because Triton was infested by a gene stealer cult that the Adeptus Custodes had to personally go and deal with. And yeah, that does seem like the kind of place a gene stealer cult would thrive, where there's nothing but disenfranchised workers and no real oversight as you drudge along in the shadows. Hell, even during the Horus Heresy, there were only a few human colonists on the moons of Neptune, and they were all effectively bowled over by the traitor forces. And not even the Space Marines. They were attacked by pirates and traitor Imperial army that Perturabo unleashed on them. They weren't even worth Space Marines. And this is compounded by the fact that during the Solar War, Neptune didn't even get its own sphere of defense. You see, the fifth sphere was Terra and Luna itself, protected by Rogel Dorn. The fourth sphere was the blockade of traitor-occupied Mars, led by Camba Diaz. The third sphere was centered around Jupiter, led by Seneschal Efreid. The second sphere oversaw Uranus, led by Fleet Master Halbrecht. And the first sphere was mainly centered around Pluto, and just had Neptune thrown in as an afterthought. In fact, Sigismund literally commanded from Pluto. And while you would think, oh, First Captain Sigismund, that's pretty impressive, you have to remember, he and Dorn were not even on speaking terms at the time, because Dorn found out about his quasi-faith in the Emperor. He was literally on ice out there. Neptune was literally the least important part of the least important sphere of defense during the Solar War. That is just rough. However, things do get interesting when you discuss the early Great Crusade and pre-Imperial era of Neptune. Because you see, while the planet had been colonized early in the Age of Terra, right before the Dark Age of Technology, it had become populated with human colonists. However, during the Age of Strife, those inhabitants would be mutated into violent, inhuman creatures. And as such, when the Great Crusade came along, they would be ordered to be wiped out. And the people to undertake this would be the Ninth Legion, the Blood Angels. So you would think, oh, it would be a really slick military operation, punctuated by the Legion's signature strength of arms and good nature. Well, you would be wrong, because this was the Blood Angels before Sanguinius was found, and at this time the Legion was so vicious and brutal and bloodthirsty that they would almost be marked for destruction. Only Sanguinius' finding and reforming of the Legion would save them. So as you can imagine, this campaign was incredibly brutal. It was tunnel fighting across Neptune's moons that would see 12,000 Space Marines dead. Probably one of the single biggest losses of life the Imperium had ever faced in the Space Marine era up until this point. But they would eventually win the campaign, and the Blood Angels would be able to replenish their numbers by recruiting from the dregs of Neptune, that being those wretched people who still lived on those moons. which I can only imagine made the Legion much more temperate. Now, the last planet on the list, which was not exactly a planet, is Pluto. Now, we have absolutely no information about Pluto before the Imperium came along, interestingly enough, which does indicate that perhaps there was no human settlement of the planet. After all, why would you really need to? There's just not that much out there, and it's so small. So, we only really know what happened during the horusheresy. Now, because of its position, and given the fact that Pluto contains the only other warp gate in the solar system, that being the Chthonic Gate, it was understandably the first planet the traitors hit when the invasion of the Sol system finally came. However, the traitors actually engaged Loyalist forces long before the Solar War properly began, and this occurred with the Alpha Legion invasion of Pluto. Also, a funny thing here, the name Chthonic in Chthonic Gate is spelled Khthonic, as opposed to starting with a C like Horus's planet of Chthoniya. And the reason for that is because Chthonic means in Greek, relating to the underworld or of the underworld. Now, you can see this in Chthoniya because it was a basically subterranean planet where gangers inhabited all the abandoned tunnels that had once been mine shafts. However, when it comes to Pluto, that is an obvious nod to Pluto being the other name for Hades, god of the underworld. And this does extend to the moons themselves, because the moons of Pluto, while absolutely tiny and no bigger than Imperial Navy starships, are inhabited on a subterranean level. Now, it isn't clear if these are actual civilians or just the staff of the installations who guard Plutonian space and keep the warp gate opened. Also, interestingly, there's nothing to indicate that the surface of Pluto itself, despite not being composed of gas like the other planets discussed, is inhabited in any way, and I think that's probably because it is just a literal ball of ice. Like, there would be literally nothing to do on the surface of Pluto other than farming frozen nitrogen and methane. Like, even the moons of Pluto back during the Horus Heresy were not used for anything interesting other than just as defense platforms. Now, while that is true for Charon, Styx, and Nyx, Hydra and Kerberos are the ones where things get interesting. You see, Hydra was an astropathic relay station, meaning that it was vitally important because if you shut it down, you could start moving troops into the solar system without immediate warning sirens going off. So for that reason, and not just because it was called Hydra, the Alpha Legion would attack that moon to draw out Rogel Dorn and the Imperial Fists, and it would be in the installations on the moon of Hydra that Dorn would slay one of the twin Primarchs of the Alpha Legion. Now, there is debate as to which of the twins died on Hydra. However, I did make an argument about it in my video, The Fate of Omegon, one that people really liked and that cemented my reputation as the Alpha Legion guy. Seriously, whenever people end up bringing up my channel online, like in Reddit discussions, they often mention, yeah, he made that one long Alpha Legion video. So as lame as Pluto is, I do have a soft spot for it. Now, all of this happened in the book Praetorian of Dorn, which covered the Alpha Legion's initial incursions into the Sol system. However, when the Solar War proper kicked off in the book, The Solar War, we get to hear about what happens on the moon of Kerberos, and it really is something else. Much like the other moons of Pluto, this one too was an orbital defense fortress. However, it would be taken by the traitors in an assault that was directed by Horus Aximand, who was leading this phase of the assault. The way he would do this would be by overwhelming the moon's initial defenses with fresh marines, that being space marines who had not been properly vetted by the traitors or even the loyalists, and effectively had just been immediately pumped through the implantation process to mass-produce space marines, many of whom would die in the process, but some of whom would make it through. So, since these guys were hardy space marines, but had very little combat experience, he would effectively use them as glorified fodder, throwing them into engagements to soften up the enemy first, before the actual veteran traitors would go in. Some of these marines of the Sons of Horus, for the short time we were with them, proved to be very, very interesting to me, and in particular one we followed from the beginnings of this assault by the name of Sagiran, who I assumed we might actually follow all the way through the Solar War and into the Siege of Terra itself, because he really proved to be that interesting and that distinct. He proves himself to, despite his lack of training, possess an immense amount of killer instinct and raw determination, which sees him through the grueling assault on the moon of Kerberos all the way to the core of the moon, where he discovers a terrible secret. Sigismund, who was in charge of this sphere of defense, had rigged the entire moon to blow. He sees the core starting to spark. He sees flashes of lightning, goes for his Vox and tries to make a run for it, but it's too late, and he knows that in his final moments, as there is a bright flash and the entire moon is annihilated. I'm gonna let you in on a secret. I actually didn't like the Solar War all that much. Other people seem to have really loved it, but I just didn't because I listened on audiobook, and hearing Samus pop up over and over again to literally whisper in my ear was so annoying to me that I just couldn't get into the Solar War. But this moment here, I loved. I loved this part of the book. It hit so hard. It gave a great send-off to this character we had just met, and really set the stakes for just how uncertain and brutal this conflict was going to be. Because this one explosion killed 205 ships. That is insane. And what's more, Hydra and Charon went off as well. 3 moons literally destroyed in one fell swoop. We don't hear anything about Styx and Nyx, so as far as we know, Pluto still has those 2 moons, and we never hear anything about them again as far as I can tell. And in fact, the only singular scrap of lore we have for Pluto in the 41st millennium is the fact that a Xenos threat was discovered amidst the Plutonian void fortresses, and the Adeptus Custodes went to deal with it. So really, Pluto is just an absolute nothing in terms of the solar system. But what sets it apart from Neptune is that for that one scrap of time, in this one brief moment where it was the center of attention, by God, it was glorious. Now you see, normally, you would think that's it, that's all there is in the solar system. However, there is one more thing, that being another dwarf planet past Pluto called Sedna, which is actually a real thing, by the way. It was discovered in 2003. Now, all we really know about Sedna is the fact that it was under the control of a warlike Xenos species, and you would think, oh, tiny little dwarf planet. Yeah, there was probably a warlike Xenos species, but the Imperium would have bowled them over. Well, no, because here's where things actually start to get nutty. Because you see, the Imperium would dispatch 8 full legions, not chapters, legions. Now, we don't have figures for how big the legions were at this time, so I would say they could be at least half the size of what they would become near the end of the Great Crusade after the Primarchs were found, but that could still be like up to 400,000 space marines for one dwarf planet. And even then, they still didn't win normally. They only defeated this Xeno species, quote, through unknown psychic means. What does that even mean? What happened out there? And get this, Sedna has since been lost to the Imperium. Now, that could be because the real-life planet Sedna has an orbital period of around 11,000 and a half years. So basically all of the Great Crusade through to the current setting has encompassed 1 year on Sedna. But with the mapping and reach of the Imperium, they should have found it. Did it just disappear? Honestly, there's a lot of weird things out in the solar system in Warhammer, like the Shrine Comet, which is a comet that orbits the Sol system every 1,000 Terran years because of an irregular elliptical route, and was actually built as an artificial construct during the Dark Age of technology by unknown people. And in fact, the Emperor actually intercepted this comet at the end of the Unification Wars to build a shrine to his victory. However, the Word-Bearers would turn it into a shrine for the worship of him, one that they would need to discreetly destroy after they got reprimanded on Monarchia. Oh, and there's also something called Artifact 9 Kappa Mu, which is, quote, a mysterious relic of the Sol system that orbits the Sun between Terra and Venus. A geodesic sphere of black metal nearly 30 kilometers in diameter. The artifact is marked by honeycomb passages and catacombs. The artifact's origin is completely unknown and may even predate the Dark Age of technology. And hell, there are even groups known as the quote-unquote Belter Coalitions that live in the asteroid belts both between Mars and Jupiter and outside of Neptune. So there's even more there, but unfortunately we have next to no lore about them. But with all that said, let's get into the ranking. And we'll start from the bottom and work our way up. I would say that the worst planet to live on would be Saturn. Because, while yes, you could be part of the Inquisition, most people in the Inquisition don't actually live in the area around Saturn. So who does live there? either slaves and menials who will be routinely mind-wiped and can never leave, or straight-up servitors. If you live on Saturn, there is a very good chance you are just a lobotomized servitor. And even if you don't consider servitors to be quote-unquote living there, there's still the fact that those slaves are gonna have nothing to do, nowhere to go, no lives, and be routinely memory wiped for safety reasons. That is a horrible existence. However, only slightly better than that would have to be Mars, because Mars is an absolutely grueling meat grinder of a planet. Because while industrial worlds can generally suck, at least they have regular employment and a stable economy. And when people think of all the troubles that come with industrial worlds, such as like on Necromunda, they're usually thinking of hive worlds, again like Necromunda, whose main problems come from the massive overpopulation. You know, too much labor competition, not enough space, not enough resources, that sort of thing. However, Mars is a forge world, and not just a forge world, the Forge World. And the problem with living on a Forge World for anyone but the upper tiers of the Mechanicus is the fact that they somehow have even less of a regard for human life than the rest of the Imperium. People are far more disposable and routinely die of heart attacks and physical ailments while on the production line. And as previously mentioned, there is a very good chance if you make a single misstep, you're gonna end up as a lobotomized servitor, which honestly might be worse than being a normal servitor, because when you're a servitor, you don't really care about much, barring a few aberrant exceptions. However, when you live in those conditions, you are under the constant fear of being made into a servitor. That is no way to live. And the environment on Mars is literal hell on Earth. It is so polluted and corroded and just destroyed. Honestly, it might be the single worst planet in the Imperium environmentally, other than Terra itself, which is next on this list. Because while Terra is maybe marginally better to live on than Mars, that's not a huge bar. Because the overwhelming majority of Terra lives in abject, squalid poverty, where life is nasty, brutish, and short, where gangs abound and insane things happen pretty regularly, especially after the opening of the Great Rift. There are insane moments involving psychers and mutations happening all the time on Terra, and if you're born as a psycher, the Sisters of Silence are gonna get to you in basically 30 seconds flat and just throw you at the Golden Throne. But really, if you read any of the books that deal with life on Terra, such as the Vaults of Terra books, you'll realize very, very quickly that you would rather live almost anywhere else. Next on the list is Neptune, because it's really cold, and nothing happens out there. You see, as previously stated, Neptune is in this awkward position between Uranus and Pluto, which both have their own gates into the solar system, and as such have more things going on and more traffic around them. The only thing we know about Neptune is that some of its moons are being used for mining, but that's it. There is literally nothing else going on out there. Nobody's gonna really come to visit, no one's gonna pass by, so all we know is that life in the Neptune system is just mining for materials on these ice-cold moons with no one around and nothing to do. Now, the reason I put that above places like Terra and Mars is because, while yes, there's really no one around and nothing to do, it's better than the alternative, that being literally crushed to death under the weight of human life and suffocating consistently, and I think I would rather risk just going steadily stir-crazy in a cold environment than the absolute nightmare that is Terra and Mars. But still, Neptune is very low on the list, simply because there is nothing. Next on the list, but kind of on the opposite end of the spectrum, is Mercury. Now, it's not as bad as Neptune because it is closer to the heart of things in the galaxy, which is going to give it some level of amenities and more development. However, it is, again, a simple mining world with really not much else going on. There just won't be that much opportunity, and all that's really going to happen is resources being shipped off to the more important worlds like Venus and Terra and Mars to have the materials from Venus manufactured. But again, it is closer to the other core worlds, so it likely won't be as bad. However, it should be noted that Mercury is very, very hot, and as such, there's probably gonna be a lot of sweltering heat, as opposed to Neptune, where you can comfortably freeze to death. And before anyone asks, the Imperium really does not care if miners are comfortable or not. Next on the list is Pluto. And Pluto, I would say, is better than Neptune because, while yes, it is a desolate frozen wasteland all the way in the boonies of the solar system, it's not as bad as Neptune or Mercury because it's not actually used for mining. It's got two things going for it. One, it's considered largely a military outpost, with some of its moons being orbital fortresses, well, at least the remaining ones, that is, and it has the chthonic gate. So that means a lot of shipping is going to come through the area, meaning there's going to be places for ships to dock, there's going to be at least some bare bones amenities, there's going to be places to buy food for the rest of the crew, and on and on. There's at least going to be some stuff there, as we see with ports in real life. And furthermore, joining the military to serve in the defense of the solar system is significantly better than mining. It's not as grueling, sure it's not going to be very exciting because just not much happens out there except for the occasional Xeno threat that the Custodes eliminated, but I guess it is better. It's just a simple, quiet posting out in the middle of the sticks with people coming through. Get it? Sticks? Eh? Also, I would like to note that being on an orbital fortress is probably better than being on an actual moon, because when it comes to Neptune, you're probably going to be on the moons, but when it comes to Pluto, you're going to be in a void fortress. You see, void fortresses have a better controlled climate, as opposed to moons, which are just really cold. Next on the list is Uranus, which is in all respects just a better version of Pluto. This is for a few reasons. The first being, it's bigger with more moons, and as such, there's more going on and less burden on each individual moon. Many of these moons are also used as defense stations to guard the Elysian Gate, which does make this planet relatively important, but not overly so to the point where you're going to be crushed under the weight of oppression like other worlds such as Cadia. Furthermore, it also has some worlds that are dedicated to habitation, which implies a bit of a middle class. And third, given its far closer proximity to the heart of the solar system, there is going to be a lot more people who enter the solar system through the Elysian Gate than the chthonic one, as they just seek to bypass the other two planets that don't really matter to them. And as such, more traffic coming through the region, more business, more trade, and more opportunity. There are job opportunities, there's habitation, there are places you can go if you're of the middle or upper class, and you are very, very well defended. I would honestly go as far as to say living on Uranus isn't all that bad, which, given the nature of things in 40k, is saying a lot. Now we get into the good places to live. And number 2 would be Venus. Now, Venus might not seem like an obvious pick because in our real current timeline, Venus is actually hotter than Mercury because of its very thick atmosphere. However, at this point in Warhammer, Venus was terraformed very, very early on in humanity's history, and as such, it does have a pretty good environment on the surface. Furthermore, it does have orbitals around Venus, which are actually luxury resorts. Now, I'm not implying that living on Venus is going to be living in the lap of luxury, however, it does show that there is an economy around Venus. Probably a hospitality-driven one, such as in places like Hawaii. Meaning if you live there, you probably have a decent job working in a resort or something like that. Now, while in real life, Venus does have a similar composition to the planet Earth, with minerals, rock, and all of that, but I couldn't find any information suggesting it's a heavily mined planet. So, while there probably is some resource extraction, it's not the main thing going on, and it's not the ecologically destroyed hell many people would assume it to be. So, Venus is probably pretty darn good to live in. You get a cushy job working in a hotel or something. Now that brings us to our number 1 planet in the solar system to live on, Jupiter. Now, Jupiter has a lot going for it. It has a lively, large-scale economy based on the production of ships and vessels, as well as the training of naval officers. So you could work in manufacturing in the shipyards, but you could also end up in the Naval Officer Corps if you go that route. And furthermore, Jupiter also has stations such as Ceres Station, which are some of the most luxurious getaway resorts outside of Venus itself, and contain, as previously stated, the finest opera house outside of the Imperial Palace itself. There is a lot of luxury to be had on Venus, and the amount of habitation implies, as previously mentioned with Uranus, the existence of a level of middle class. because those shipyard workers aren't just going to be mindless industrial grunts. There is a level of skill necessary when it comes to the construction of ships. And furthermore, as far as I can tell, there are no mining operations in the Jupiter system, meaning that the Jupiterian economy is not one of resource extraction, but of goods production, which in real-world economics precludes a higher standard of living as opposed to a resource-based economy. So there are things to do, there are different job opportunities, there's a middle class, and there's respect. Because if you're in maybe a little bit of the upper middle class, you might be a member of one of the Jovian Void clans, one of the few cultures that did survive when the Imperium came knocking. Because even compliant cultures, such as the ones around Saturn or the Azurites, were either explicitly wiped out one way or the other, or just kind of drop off the face of the galaxy, while the Jovian Void clans stayed loyal to the Imperium and were very well respected within the Imperial Navy and the hierarchy of the Sol system. This is coupled with the fact that the ships and officers produced around Jupiter are so good that even the Martians are jealous of them. And I know for the lowest classes that's not really gonna mean much, but for a lot of people, that does help them give a sense of purpose in life, knowing that you do matter, that you are respected. So, for the reasons of economic diversity, quality of life, and reputation, I deem Jupiter to be the best planet to live on in the Sol system, with Venus as a very respectable close second, and Uranus as an understandable third, with everything else falling away into bad to awful territory. But what do you guys think? Do you guys agree with my rankings here, or do you have a different list in mind? Do you guys perhaps know of anything I missed in my assessment of the planets? I'd love to hear what you guys have to say in the comments below. Again, please subscribe if you have not already done so, and I will see you in the next video.